Moving on, ladies and gentlemen, next our plenary speaker. He's come to us all the way from Barcelona with practice based in Bangkok, Singapore, and Barcelona. He has been doing a lot of work in Mumbai, and he's here with us this evening to talk about the power of process. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Mr. Hans Brouwer from HB Designs. And make sure y'all are tagging us in all the pictures and videos y'all are taking at IDAC Expo. Please do tag us. Thank you.
Coming here, it's been really a great pleasure being here in front of you all and hearing all these wonderful talks. It seems that two themes are dominating, thinking and making. It seems to be that everyone's interested in that. So today, I put together a presentation that's really about the power of process and a little bit of the history of how my firm has evolved its design approach. The idea that we have to put time into things in order to get value out of it. I'm sure you all agree that when your clients come to you and say you've been appointed and then ask you to do your concept design in 3 weeks, it's always a bit disappointing because it probably took them months, if not years, to get to that point where they want to launch the project. And they tend not to understand that it takes time and it takes process to get to good ideas. So I'm talking a little bit about that. I want to tell a little bit of the origin story of I guess, where I developed my design philosophy. Right after school, I was lucky enough to join the firm of Norman Foster in London. It was a small firm of about 60 people. It's now over 2,000, so it's changed quite a bit. But because it was reasonably small, I got to work with Norman, see a little bit how he approached architecture and design, and really how it was about how you see the problems and how you define them. And two things always came to the fore: experimentation and testing, and seeing if the ideas you have are borne out as they get implemented. And the other one is the power of making, I guess, and the belief that architecture is about building buildings and not about doing drawings. So I was lucky enough to have 3 projects that I was sort of responsible for, and they were very different in scale, but all of which were predicated on some form of interesting idea or innovation. This was a series of houses along the coastline which were based on a traditional Japanese sort of architectural approach, but with very modern materials. Versus this office building or mixed-use office building, which is and was and still is today the first and only open atrium office building in Japan. And finally, I was the director for this project, which is the Commerzbank headquarters, which is probably the first green eco tower in the world. It was in 1993 when I was doing this, and it's predicated on reducing energy emissions, global footprint, natural ventilation, etc. So all of these taught me a lot. So I ended up starting my firm in 1995, and in the last 27 years, we've grown a little bit and have had quite a bit of experience. So today I want to talk a little bit about what we have developed, which is what I call the evolutionary process of design, the way we arrive at an idea. Sometimes people think that the creative process in architecture is you give the architect the brief, the site, and he goes away and comes up with an idea and then goes ta-da and shows it to you. It's actually much more than that. It's really about integrating a lot of variables into your understanding of something. So we've come up with the idea that is predicated on Charles Darwin's evolutionary thinking. And what he discovered back after he came back from his Beagle trip is that the way nature works is that it throws out mutations. These are quite random, but the mutations get tested in their habitat. And as a result of whether a mutation works or not, it gets to propagate and gets advanced. And so there's an iterative process by which species evolve over generations of evolution, testing, and moving forward from that generate the outcomes. And so you could not have designed a giraffe as an idea, as a concept. It had to come from the iterative process of evolving longer legs, longer neck, the horns, everything about it is a response to environment, to nature, and to testing. So we kind of have developed something very similar. All of our clients, I'll admit, are developers. They're a very tough bunch. And there are a lot of metrics of performance that go well beyond the aesthetic. And so we've tended to sort of find a lot of interest in the way, when we approach it, we go very wide first, and we look at a lot of different schemes, and we test them. And we do that with the client and the client team in a sort of collaborative workshop environment. So the idea is that you get early buy-in into the beginnings of a project where you go from maybe 10 schemes to 8 to 7 to 6, and eventually you arrive at a scheme that has evolved out of that process. And we found that this has been a very successful way of arriving at a piece of architecture. And oftentimes we're very surprised by what comes out because we don't have an idea about it beforehand. We let it inform us through this process. Combined with that is the idea of the architecture of making. And I think from the very beginnings with Norman, as well as my own interest in sort of making things, it's also a part of what architects need to remember. We live in an era of imageability, from Instagram to TikTok to Facebook, and you name it. And architecture can quickly devolve into image making. We have wonderful tools for 3D visualization. We can render things, extremely well. But if we forget that we actually have to build buildings and not do drawings, we are often running the risk of not doing architecture, but making imagery. So these are some of the projects that have been in our portfolio. I'm just showing 2 houses, which go beyond just simple compositional form and really look at materiality, the timber cladding here, and how that is actually organized into a clear system of construction, how it's mounted, and going right down into the detail of how that comes about. So we're interested in that joint. It's not an open joint, it's a 45-degree bevel joint, so you can't see through to the wall behind, you can't see the struts. Every bolt and every fixture has to be thought through and drawn, even the location of switches, etc. So it's that sort of spectrum of interest from the global to the detail that is very interesting in architecture and in our industry, the construction industry. This is another house, which is, again, a very tropical house. It's in Singapore. It's defined by large planes, a horizontal plane, which is the sort of sheltering plane from rain and sun, as well as the vertical plane, which is the screen wall that divides the house into servant and served, but also creates space. That's Corten steel. That's aluminium on the roof. And you can see here the beauty of, first of all, composition, but also the way materials have to be integrated. So we always take great care in the way we draw things and understanding that every joint is defined by the material that it's made from. Every support system has to be understood in order to be designed. And so that's become part of our philosophy. This is an idea about walls that are not just about creating rooms, but creating spaces. The south and the context was quite busy, but we were able to borrow this garden from next door by creating an opening and framing it in a certain way and using this wall to screen out our neighbors so that we could create an environment for the home that was defined by these elements in space. So I'm going to show 3 projects as a result of this idea of process. One's a house, and one's a ground scraper, and one's a skyscraper. So it's an illustration that the scale is really irrelevant. It's really more about the approach and how one begins to arrive at an idea that might be surprising, even to the creator himself. So this is a house that was in a site, kind of a suburban site in Singapore, surrounded by lots of other houses. And there are a couple of key themes that we pursued. One was about the clarity of form. We ended up coming up with an idea that the served spaces, which are the bedrooms, bathrooms, and all the sort of cellular spaces, could be housed in a sort of elevated box that also creates an undercroft, which is where the living spaces are, that were then sheltered by that box. The other idea was a pattern, that the box itself should be driven by an unusual pattern. The client were a creative couple. She was a musician, he was a publisher. And we're very interested in the narrative of things. And so the idea of creating pattern combined with lines and materiality to create an unusual piece of architecture. The house as well became a message about the couple itself. So this is a plan of the house, and these are adjacent houses. Of course, there's a site plan, there's a road as well, but the house came out as basically 2 blocks, which followed pretty much the site parameters. This is a very simple premise, but an atrium that runs down through the entire top 2 floors into the basement. But the idea was to try and frame the views from all the rooms inside, because the lower level was actually screened by landscaping. So we created this 3D model of the house, which is basically the 2 volumes on the top. And then we started to place cameras inside each of the rooms and tried to understand from the site itself how you could frame the extended environment so that you wouldn't see your neighbors. Very simple thing. And so these cones of view, which are basically a camera place, 60-degree cone, interfaced with this volume and created openings in them that were basically windows. And the windows became openings that then became larger, that then became part of an extended pattern, which is this sort of weaving pattern that became a breakdown of the materiality of the building, that then became sort of this sort of composite pattern of solid and void. And you can see here that basically, again, we couldn't have thought of this pattern in any rational way other than by the process by which we arrived at it. So you can see here the elevational component of the box has the voids, the large-scale openings, and it has the larger sort of framing, which is the larger joint lines, and then the sort of the micro scale, which is the subdivision of these panels into workable sizes of metal cladding. It ended up being a copper-clad building. And so these were sort of the three elevations that went around it, which created some unusual spaces. An early study of the actual massing. So you can see the lower floor suspended up. We ended up extending the box, the pool on one side. And the project ends up looking something like this. So here you're looking from the main garden. You see these large extended canopies on column-free spaces. So the inside-outside transparency of the tropical home is a very nice place to live. The client basically spends all his time under that terrace. It's got fans, it's got lights. The kitchen's on the right, the living room is on the left. And upstairs is a studio, master bedrooms, other bedrooms. And you see the windows create this very unusual pattern. And within that pattern, we still had to design sort of sensible windows, these rectangles. So orthogonal windows are built within that. That means that either sliding or top-hung windows can work. But again, the idea was that we wanted to create this unusual house, which has a sort of dichotomy of fixed rooms, open spaces, solid voids, geometry, versus workability. This is looking at it from the street as you look up. And this is the space between the blocks, the atrium, that runs from the top, which is this copper-clad element, down through the middle of the house. And so you can see here, that's the basement. The planting comes right the way up. His studio is over here, living, dining is there, and the kitchen is here. So it's a very sort of unusual house. And it went through so many iterations that I didn't show you before it got to this, that it's a bit surprising to us also to see how it evolved. And we're very good friends with the owners now. 15 years they've been living here. And every time we go back, I'm actually delighted by the house because it surprises me every time, because I could not have conceived of it at the outset as part of a creative effort. The next one is here actually in India. It's our first project in Pune. I was approached by Vishwajit Java of Marvel to design an office building on a very large horizontal site. The site was actually 220 meters long, had a public park in the back, and it had a 40-meter height restriction, so it was a very unusual sort of scheme. It has about 1 million square feet of office space, and it was supposed to be sold in chunks, either a 100 square meter office or up to the entire building. It was basically one of those where he says, I want flexibility to be able to cater to small, medium, and large offices. And so what we did is we investigated different ways of dealing with the exact same brief, from a sort of perimeter courtyard building to a linear toast rack scheme to a series of circular silos as a sort of a theme of a park. And eventually we arrived at a very simple premise, which is to say, let's take the largest buildable footprint and line it with a curvilinear shape to create this sort of unusual skyline, and then hollow out the center based on a very simple premise of a 22-meter deep floor plate, which gives you 10 meters deep from the facade, 2-meter corridor, 10. And again, natural lighting all came in. This was LEED Platinum certified. And so that became the sort of the basis of further workings, which we then had to test and evolve into a much more complex system of not only engineering but space design. It ended up having 8 cores, and the reason for that is so that you could divide each of these floor plates into 2 halves. So you could have one half of the floor plate, which is quite a small tendency, having its own lift core. So it became a mini office. If you rented that part of the floor, you'd have your own lift lobby and your own toilets and your own air handling units. Or you could take a petal, or you could take a half, or you could take an entire wing, which is 8 floors this way. So the idea that you could slice and dice the building and take up different tendencies. In the end, somebody took one entire wing, and that became an office. And some are actually 100 square meter spaces within a shared corridor. What was interesting is the idea of, I guess, the multi-tenancies, and we came up to the roof level. And so In the end, from the concept, we also had to understand how to implement it. So the geometry had to be rationalized, the grids had to be rationalized, the cores had to be rationalized. These two are these naturally ventilated galleries, which basically, again, trying to keep the air conditioning loads down. All the public areas are naturally ventilated. Pune has a very nice climate, in fact, quite cool and dry generally most of the year. And we also developed the idea of different facades. The outside is actually a very environmental responsive facade. It's a multi-layered facade. So the glass line is the thermal envelope, and then there is an environmental envelope which screens out about 40% of the sun. And in between we have terraces that become breakout spaces. The inside is in fact self-shading, and so it doesn't need any of that, and it becomes a very simple curtain wall system. And so working with Meinhardt out of Australia, because of fairly high performance criteria, we understand better the energy consumption, the different sort of modes of how the building responds to light, heat, etc. And of course, computational fluid dynamics also helps us to understand this. And also, as part of the process, so again, this is probably a 1.5-year design process that lends itself to quite a lot of iterative approaches that understand the building's outcome. And at the beginning, we understood there would be a sort of layered facade, so the curtain wall, the balconies, and then the framing system for the actual facade. And we started off thinking we could use a simple CalZip product. It ended up being far too expensive, and I'll go into that in a bit later. But the idea of these double-height terraces, which at the time in Pune were FSI free, so you could have them everywhere. And so every office gets an outdoor terrace, which became a very nice concept for an office, which we don't usually see, a place where people can go take their tiffin and have a lunch, or go out for a smoke, because they're not allowed to smoke in the office, or take a phone call outside, being in the building still. And you'll see how that kind of evolved. So here's that interstitial space where we make use of this 2.4 meter zone between the solar layer, in fact, a sort of a design layer, which is the facade of the building, and the actual thermal envelope, which is the double glazed performance facade, with these terraces. We cut these holes out in the terraces where they are so that you could have a view out as well. We got this tested, and this is an early sort of testing rendering of that space with the cutouts, the heights, and how that sort of space between terraces looks. And this is how it turned out in the end. In order to get the terrace, the screen actually approved in terms of budget, we had to actually develop it from scratch, and that was where the making came in. We worked with specialist manufacturers who had expanded meshes, very thin meshes, 0.8 millimeter mesh, which you could expand and then corrugate. So as a result of that, our first test, we actually used solid aluminum, and in order to make the screen, the aluminum had to be 1.6 millimeter thick. In order to punch out 40% of the openings, we had to punch the aluminum, that you lost that. So effectively, at 1 square meter, you paid of very thick 1.6 millimeter aluminum, and you threw away 40%. This takes 1 square meter of aluminum and stretches it by 60%. That's how expanded mesh works. It stretches it because it gives you that zigzag pattern. And because of the corrugations, we could reduce it to 0.8. So the amount of aluminum here is only 30% of the original design, which took a while to get to. And as a result of, basically, I wouldn't have had the screen if I couldn't come up with a way to build it at the right price, would never have happened. And then you can see how the screen sort of turns out. It's actually quite diaphanous. The sort of ability to sit out there and feel quite sort of gently screened from the sun. And today you still see lots of people sitting out there and having their lunches and then going back into their office. So we're very happy with this idea that a building can have multiple zones of habitation, especially in an office, which tends to be a curtain wall system. And this is inside that interstitial space, looking up through this stepped terraces, which is the pattern you get when you have to have a double height space throughout. There's also this wonderful space, which we call the cathedral, which is a 40-meter high open space linked by bridges that connect the 4 cores on one end, and we have 2 of these galleries on each side. Inside here, we have meeting rooms that are located, which are common meeting rooms. And we've also created these very large, what we call monsoon louvers, which are 1.2 meters deep by 1 meter pitch. So basically, even when it's pouring hard rain, you don't get that moisture coming in because there's always bounce and things like that. So a lot of this goes into sort of the experimentation of how to solve a problem and create this very beautifully lit and well-protected, naturally ventilated corridor. These are the meeting rooms that are sort of cantilevered off that. So again, working with the engineers, getting this to stand up has also been a great delight. And finally, you get to see the inside of this, which is a very different world. This is the world where it's self-shading because the building's quite a small, tight courtyard, and so we don't need any screening whatsoever. We had these refuge terraces that were required by law, single height and a certain percentage of the floor plate, but we made them triple height and put planting in them and created what we called urban voids, where you could see right through that, from over here through this to the street. And here you see the composite effect of the ground floor courtyard that runs under the building, the natural sort of cathedral galleries, and this sort of curtain wall that runs around. I'm doing quite well. I have one more project to go. And that's when you see it from the street. So this is the Solitaire Business Hub in Pune, and we are very grateful for this flag because it brought us to India in 2008, and we're still here today, which is great. This is something very different. It's not yet built. It's just out of the box. It's a little bit of a secret, so I can't tell you exactly where it is, other than it's in Mumbai. But it's basically a different approach of evolution and just showing how we solve the problem of a particular site. If you're familiar with Mumbai, you'll probably know the Sultan Mosque over there. You'll know that the race course is over here. This is a very prime area, and the site's very small. It had a huge amount of real estate to be put on it. So the variables involved were 4 different unit types, high density floor plate, very high-end clientele, which had very detailed concerns about how the units might work. Obviously, views were of primary importance, understanding these and understanding how to maximize these, let alone creating an iconic building and dealing with parking, etc. So we then generated basically 20 different schemes, all of which we looked at on all of these things with 3 different teams. So again, it's kind of an interesting process where everyone comes at it, and it went through several rounds. It wasn't 20 in 1 week. It was going through several rounds. And everybody learned from everyone else's scheme, which is kind of interesting because you learn every time you do it. It's a bit like playing the piano or any other sport. You practice, you fall, you get back up, you do it again. And we found that when it comes to very complex projects, which are not simple, they're not singular in their creative outcomes, doing this helps us to gain fluency in the mechanics of the design so that we can become creative eventually. We can't be creative right at the beginning because you just make too many mistakes. So we did find out at the end of the day that this option worked the best, and we're doing this together with the client team, which includes structural engineers, city planners for statutory requirements, as well as MEP, etc. And then we ended up finding out that this is the way we want to do it. 2 similar towers, 4 units each, 2 of the primary units, 4 and 5 bedrooms facing the west, which is the prime view, the smaller 2 and 3 bedrooms facing the east, which is also a beautiful view. You can see it there on that view. And then basically playing a little bit with the heights to sort of get the overall volumetrics. So again, seeing how we can sort of explain this to the client, because eventually he was trying to get the building parallel to the site, which made sense in the site plan, but didn't make sense with regards to the view. So we did a lot of view studies and said we have to rotate this about 20 degrees to create a better relationship with the environment. We'll work out the details in the top and the bottom as we go along. We created the offset for sort of, I guess, skyline presence, the idea that we want to create 2 distinct sort of towers with different things happening at the top. And then we also talked to the engineers who said he needs external trusses. They're called outrigger trusses in high-rise buildings. They bring the power of the columns back to the core and they help stabilize it. Any really tall building, and this is 300 meters, by the way, so it's very tall. You need these trusses. So we said, why don't we celebrate those trusses to create distinction in the overall massing, so it doesn't just become one single extrusion, but also create special spaces. Those voids become something, facilities or special units. And then we said, let's make the top of the building a higher floor to floor. So we went from 3.4 to 4.5 and said, let's create a penthouse zone that then can work with rooftop amenities as well as podium amenities. So it becomes, again, a sort of, once the big picture is settled, you begin to delve into how the project can become better. And it's a bit like engineering. A BMW doesn't happen overnight. It happens over testing, crash tests, this, that, wind tunnels, etc. And so this iterative approach also applies to the way a project refines itself over time. Introducing key themes. Some of them are about spaces and interiors for the units, which are very important. Some of them have more to do with more ancillary features like the community building and the facilities that we have. And other ones have to do with experiences, how you arrive at the place, how you move through it, lobbies, drop-offs, etc. And then, of course, at the end, there's the imageability as a building, as a piece of real estate. It needs to be eye-catching. It needs to have a presence on the skyline. It's this particular client's first super high building in such a prime area, so it was a very important sort of launch pad. This was a competition, by the way. I think 5 firms were invited, and apparently we've won, so I'm allowed to show this. So this is how the project kind of came together, and this is more of a kind of building it up from the ground up. We have a very high podium, 32 meters height, on top of which are facilities. The cores lead to 2 different towers. We have refuge floors on every 7 floors, and we have these special floors that we've introduced as well. And then we have basically the facade. And what we've tried to do with the facade, which I'll show you a little bit in detail, is to create something that has a little bit more going on than just a typical unit elevated and then repeated up. We've tried to create double height spaces. We've tried to differentiate between the 4 and the 5 bedroom. We've tried to also create a screen wall on the sides, which is where we have no windows, or basically only bathroom windows, because it's also a texture for these to look out onto. So those are vertical screens. And then, of course, in the end, we end up with a building that looks like this. So this is the competition scheme. And here we usually start with this grayscale kind of drawing because it simplifies the building into its primary massing sort of identity. We then sort of add the sky to it, and you get the sense how this building might contribute to the skyline on this very prime spot next to the race course. And eventually we obviously add lighting and materials, the handrails, the balustrades, and we set it to sunset light, and you get a sense of the promise of the building. And so when it comes to a competition, this was a 4-week competition. So again, I think one of the reasons we were probably successful is because of the amount of work we've done, the ability to sort of show how it might become more than just an idea. And also going into the experiential. So this is a typical 5-bedroom unit where, of course, the view is the big sell, but at the same time, the idea that we can sort of present, this is how it might feel to be in there. We have the deep terrace. This is what's called the flex space, which is an additional space that's adjacent to the living room, which you can attach to the living room or separate, make a home office or make a gym. And then you can see here on the right-hand corner, on this side here, there is a double height space. So the terraces bounce around a little bit. So every 5-bedroom has a double height space where you have the spatial delight, but you can also host larger planting. If you see it from the outside, again, the setting within Mumbai, which I think is a very rare promise where you end up with this view, but here you can see the idea of the facade. So the separation between the 4-bedroom and the 5-bedroom unit is a clear sort of facade element. We have these horizontal shading devices that begin to create very strong sort of horizontal lines that go across the whole facade. And then you have these double height spaces that then create these unusual opportunities for the terraces to actually get this height, and for its host also some double height planting. And then we have this last view, which is basically a kind of distant view from the sea, looking over the bay with the podium in it. And as it sort of moves up the building, exaggerating its height, again, it's a 70-story building, 70 and 60, as you end up at the top. So again, in some ways it is about this. In some ways that's the outcome, and it could have been just as simple as saying, here, do you like it? But we found that people respond in one of 2 ways when you do that. I like it, or I don't like it. Whereas if you explain how it comes to be, if you involve people in the journey, and you say, this is and how would you do it? Everybody ended up feeling they had ownership in this project. And as a result, I think it ends up becoming a much more interesting way to develop the buildings. And we found that our clients have become our collaborators. And it also allows us to, I guess, retain some humility in that we're not the authors of everything. We're sort of the curators, I guess, or maybe the conductors, but we don't play every instrument. There are lots of people who know other things better. And so having that kind of open round table approach we found to be a really fun way to work, an interesting way to arrive at solutions, and so far I have to say it's been a reasonably successful business model, at least in India. So thank you very much for your time. I'll leave you with that.
Thank you for that wonderful, wonderful presentation. May I now call on stage Mr. Prateek Koka from Nexion International to please felicitate Mr. Brouwer.